The fastest mistake is often the hardest one to take back. Nobody inside Courtroom 4B expected history to be made that morning. The hearing had already attracted reporters, attorneys, community leaders, and curious spectators from across the county. Every wooden bench was nearly full. Legal documents covered tables near the front of the room. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across polished wood surfaces while the steady ticking of the courtroom clock echoed through the silence. It felt like any other important day inside an American courthouse. Then, in less than 3 seconds, everything changed. Officer Rebecca Collins had spent nearly a decade working courthouse security. She trusted her instincts. She trusted her experience. Most of all, she trusted her ability to recognize trouble before it appeared. That confidence had become part of her identity. So when she saw something that morning she believed required immediate action, she did not hesitate. The room froze. Attorneys stopped speaking mid-sentence. Reporters lowered their pens. Spectators rose halfway from their seats. A sealed folder slipped from someone's hands and landed on the polished floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud against the sudden silence. At the center of the chaos stood Rebecca. Her breathing was controlled. Her posture remained firm. For a brief moment, she believed she had prevented a serious problem. But as the silence stretched longer and longer, uncertainty began creeping into the edges of her confidence. Across the room stood Marcus Reed. The black man who had entered the courthouse unnoticed only hours earlier now found himself at the center of every eye in the building. Yet what shocked people most was not the situation itself. It was his reaction. Marcus did not shout. He did not argue. He did not demand explanations. Instead, he remained remarkably calm. His expression carried the composure of someone who understood far more than everyone else around him. Several spectators exchanged nervous glances. Something felt wrong. Not with Marcus. With the assumptions that had brought everyone to this moment. Then the attention of the entire courtroom shifted toward Judge Harold Whitmore. The veteran judge had presided over hundreds of complicated proceedings during his career. Normally his expression revealed very little. But now the color seemed to drain from his face. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus. The reaction sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Why would a federal judge look concerned by the identity of an ordinary courtroom visitor? Why did several attorneys suddenly appear uncomfortable? Why did a court clerk quietly whisper something to a colleague before looking away? Rebecca noticed all of it. For the first time that morning, a question entered her mind. What if she did not fully understand what was happening? The courtroom remained silent. Nobody wanted to speak first. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever invisible realization was spreading through the room. Marcus slowly glanced toward the judge. The judge looked back at him. No words were exchanged, but the brief moment seemed to carry the weight of an entire conversation. And standing there beneath the harsh courthouse lights, surrounded by reporters, attorneys, and spectators, Officer Rebecca Collins felt something she had not expected to feel that day. Doubt. Because deep down, she was beginning to understand that the man everyone had overlooked might be the most important person in the entire building. 2 hours earlier, the courthouse looked like any other government building on a busy weekday morning. Lawyers carried briefcases through security checkpoints. Court employees moved between offices balancing stacks of paperwork. Reporters gathered near bulletin boards reviewing schedules for the day's hearings. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the skyline while commuters hurried along crowded sidewalks. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would soon become the subject of conversations throughout the county. At 8:07 a.m., Marcus Reed stepped through the courthouse entrance carrying a slim black portfolio. He wore a charcoal suit, a white shirt, and a conservative tie. There was nothing flashy about him. Nothing designed to attract attention. Most people never looked twice. That was exactly how Marcus preferred it. He passed through security, thanked the deputy working the checkpoint, and continued toward the main corridor. Along the way he noticed details that most visitors ignored. He noticed which courtrooms had attracted reporters. He noticed which employees appeared rushed and which appeared relaxed. He noticed conversations stopping when certain officials entered a room. Years of experience had taught him that important information often revealed itself long before anyone realized they were sharing it. Near Courtroom 4B, several reporters discussed an upcoming hearing expected to draw public interest. Marcus slowed his pace just enough to listen. He never interrupted. He never introduced himself. He simply observed. The hearing involved questions surrounding public accountability, a subject that had generated considerable attention across the region. Inside the courtroom, preparations were already underway. Clerks organized exhibits. Attorneys reviewed legal arguments. The atmosphere carried the quiet tension that often accompanies important proceedings. Marcus entered and selected a seat near the back of the gallery. From there he could see the entire room without attracting attention. He placed his portfolio beside him and opened a small notebook. For nearly 30 minutes, he sat quietly while people entered and exited. Nobody seemed concerned about his presence. To everyone else, he appeared to be another observer waiting for the hearing to begin. Across the room, Officer Rebecca Collins started her morning assignment. She greeted courthouse employees, checked security procedures, and monitored the growing crowd. Rebecca had earned a reputation for being decisive. She believed hesitation created risk. Throughout her career, that belief had reinforced her confidence again and again. This morning felt no different. Yet as she scanned the gallery, her attention briefly settled on Marcus. The moment lasted only a second before she looked away. Still, something about him remained in her thoughts. Perhaps it was the way he watched everything so carefully. Perhaps it was the confidence he carried without displaying authority. Whatever the reason, she noticed him. Marcus continued, reviewing notes while the courtroom slowly filled. The large clock above the rear wall moved steadily toward the start of the hearing. Conversations blended into a constant murmur. Reporters prepared questions. Attorneys organized final documents. Everything appeared perfectly normal. But hidden beneath the routine movements of the morning, two separate paths were quietly moving toward the same destination. One was guided by observation. The other was guided by assumption. Neither Marcus Reed nor Rebecca Collins knew it yet, but before the day ended, those two paths would collide in front of an entire courtroom. Officer Rebecca Collins had built her reputation on one simple belief: hesitation creates problems. During nearly 10 years working courthouse security, she had learned to trust her instincts, sometimes more than reports, more than procedures, and occasionally more than the explanations people offered. That confidence had earned her praise from supervisors who appreciated quick decisions. It had also earned criticism from colleagues who believed she acted before gathering all the facts. Rebecca rarely paid attention to those criticisms. In her experience, waiting too long created risk. Acting quickly prevented it. At least that was what she believed. As the morning continued, she moved through the courthouse with the confidence of someone who knew every hallway, every courtroom, and every routine. She greeted deputies, checked entrances, and monitored the growing crowd gathering for the hearing in Courtroom 4B. Everything appeared normal. Yet her attention kept returning to one person sitting quietly near the back of the gallery. Marcus Reed. He was doing nothing unusual. He had not interrupted anyone. He had not broken any rules. He simply sat observing the room with an attentiveness that Rebecca found difficult to ignore. Several times she caught herself glancing toward him. Each time she told herself she was merely doing her job. Still, the feeling remained. Something about him seemed different. Near the courtroom entrance, Deputy Aaron Mitchell noticed her watching the gallery. Aaron had worked alongside Rebecca for years and understood her habits better than most people. Following her gaze, he spotted Marcus sitting alone with a notebook beside his portfolio. "You have been looking at that guy all morning," Aaron said quietly. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Have you noticed him?" Aaron glanced again. "The man reading notes?" "Yes." Aaron shrugged. "Looks like a witness." Rebecca did not answer immediately. "Maybe." Aaron smiled faintly. You sound unconvinced. Something feels off, Rebecca replied. Aaron studied Marcus for a moment. Did he do something? The question lingered in the air. Rebecca searched for an answer and found none. Marcus had done nothing suspicious. Nothing threatening. Nothing that justified the concern growing in her mind. Yet the concern remained. Aaron eventually returned to his duties, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts. Across the room, Marcus stood briefly and walked toward a public information table near the side wall. He reviewed a few documents, exchanged a polite greeting with a court clerk, and returned to his seat. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute. The clerk even smiled before returning to her work. To everyone else, it looked completely ordinary. To Rebecca, it felt like another piece of a puzzle she could not yet solve. The courtroom clock continued ticking toward the start of the hearing. Attorneys organized case files. Reporters reviewed notes. Spectators filled empty seats. The atmosphere carried the quiet tension of an important legal proceeding. Through it all, Marcus remained calm. He watched. He listened. He wrote occasional notes. And without realizing it, Rebecca continued building conclusions based not on evidence, but on instinct. Deep inside the courthouse, two very different approaches to judgment were moving steadily toward the same moment. One relied on observation and patience. The other relied on certainty. Before the morning was over, only one of them would prove reliable. By 9:20 that morning, Courtroom 4B had become a study in quiet anticipation. Every bench seemed occupied. Reporters adjusted recording equipment. Attorneys reviewed final notes. Court clerks organized exhibits near the front of the room. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across polished wood surfaces while the large clock above the rear wall marked each passing minute with steady precision. To most people, it looked like an ordinary courtroom preparing for an important hearing. To Marcus Reed, it looked like a room full of information waiting to reveal itself. He remained seated near the back of the gallery with his portfolio resting beside him. From time to time he made brief notes in his notebook. His movements were calm and deliberate. He never appeared rushed. He never appeared nervous. Instead, he watched the room with the patience of someone who understood that people often revealed the most about themselves when they believed nobody was paying attention. Across the courtroom, Officer Rebecca Collins continued monitoring the crowd. The hearing had not officially begun, yet she found herself paying less attention to the room as a whole and more attention to one specific individual. Every time Marcus stood, she noticed. Every time he moved toward a table or spoke briefly with a clerk, she noticed. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. The more she observed him, the more convinced she became that there was something she was missing. What troubled her most was that she could not identify exactly what it was. Near the side wall, Marcus briefly approached a public document table to review materials connected to the day's proceedings. An elderly man accidentally dropped several papers while reaching for a folder. Marcus immediately stopped and helped gather the documents. The man thanked him with a smile. Marcus nodded politely and returned to his seat. Several people nearby barely noticed the interaction. Rebecca did. She watched every second of it. Yet instead of easing her concerns, the moments somehow deepened them. The confidence Marcus carried seemed unusual. He moved through the courthouse as though he belonged there, yet nobody appeared to know him. Moments later, Judge Harold Whitmore entered through a side door and took his place behind the bench. Conversations gradually faded. The courtroom settled into silence. As the judge reviewed preliminary documents, his eyes briefly moved across the gallery. For a fraction of a second, they paused on Marcus. The moment was subtle enough that most people would have missed it entirely. Marcus did not react. The judge quickly returned his attention to the paperwork before him. Yet something about the exchange felt significant. Rebecca noticed it too. The hearing began. Attorneys presented opening arguments. Court staff distributed exhibits. Reporters filled pages with notes. Through it all, Marcus remained quiet, listening carefully to every word. He appeared less interested in the outcome of the case than in the people participating in it. Rebecca continued watching him from her position near the entrance. Neither of them spoke. Neither approached the other. Yet an invisible tension was beginning to form between them. One person was collecting facts. The other was collecting impressions. One trusted observation. The other trusted instinct. And as the proceedings moved forward beneath the bright courthouse lights, both were unknowingly approaching a moment that would test which approach deserved to be trusted. The hearing had been underway for nearly 40 minutes when the moment arrived. Not a dramatic moment. Not the kind that announces itself with noise or warning. The kind that seems completely ordinary until people look back and realize everything changed because of it. Judge Harold Whitmore was reviewing a series of procedural documents while attorneys presented arguments from opposite sides of the courtroom. Reporters continued taking notes. Spectators listened quietly. The atmosphere remained controlled, professional, and predictable. Marcus Reed sat near the back of the gallery, listening carefully. A small notebook rested beside his portfolio. Every so often he added a brief observation before returning his attention to the proceedings. To anyone watching, he appeared to be another attentive observer. Yet there was something different about the way he listened. He seemed less interested in the arguments themselves than in the conduct of the people making them. Near the entrance, Officer Rebecca Collins maintained her position while monitoring the room. Her attention continued drifting toward Marcus. By now she had spent nearly 2 hours watching him. Every ordinary action somehow reinforced her belief that something about him did not fit. The problem was simple. She still had no evidence. Only instinct. Then an unexpected development occurred. A court clerk approached the judge and handed him a document that appeared to require additional supporting material. Judge Whitmore reviewed it briefly before making a note. From his seat, Marcus seemed to recognize the issue immediately. He opened his portfolio and carefully removed a sealed folder. The movement itself was calm and deliberate. Several people nearby barely noticed. Marcus stood and took a step toward the aisle, appearing ready to provide information connected to the discussion taking place at the front of the courtroom. That was when everything began moving in different directions at once. Rebecca saw Marcus stand with the folder in his hands. Her attention instantly locked onto him. The concerns she had been building all morning suddenly felt confirmed in her mind. She moved toward him and instructed him to stop where he was. The courtroom grew quiet. Marcus immediately complied. He stopped walking. He remained calm. He explained that he believed he possessed documentation relevant to the matter being discussed. His voice was measured and respectful. But Rebecca had already committed herself to a conclusion. Several spectators turned to watch. Attorneys paused their conversations. Reporters lowered their pens. The atmosphere shifted. What should have been an ordinary exchange suddenly felt charged with tension. The sealed folder slipped from Marcus's hand and landed on the polished courtroom floor. The sound echoed throughout the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed frozen in place. Marcus looked toward the folder. Rebecca looked toward Marcus. Then every eye turned toward Judge Whitmore. The veteran judge stared at the folder lying near the center aisle. Something about it immediately captured his attention. Slowly, he rose from the bench. The movement alone was enough to unsettle the room. Judges rarely interrupted proceedings without reason. Yet the expression on his face suggested that he had just recognized something important. Something serious. Something that nobody else seemed to understand. As silence settled over courtroom 4B, Rebecca felt her confidence begin to weaken for the first time that morning. Because the concern she now saw in the judge's eyes was not directed at Marcus Reed. It was directed at what had just happened to him. The silence inside courtroom 4B felt heavier than any argument that had taken place that morning. Nobody seemed willing to move. Nobody seemed willing to speak. Even the reporters who had been writing constantly throughout the hearing now sat frozen with their pens resting above their notebooks. Judge Harold Whitmore slowly stepped down from the bench and walked toward the sealed folder resting on the polished floor. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly through the room. Every eye followed him. Officer Rebecca Collins remained standing near the center aisle. Only minutes earlier she had felt completely certain of her judgment. Now that certainty was beginning to disappear. The judge bent down and carefully picked up the folder. For several seconds he simply looked at it. Then he examined a marking attached to the front. Something changed in his expression immediately. The color seemed to fade from his face. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged confused glances. Court staff looked toward one another as though searching for answers. Judge Whitmore opened the folder just enough to review the identification attached inside. The reaction was impossible to miss. He closed the folder again and looked directly at Marcus Reed. What surprised everyone was not concern. It was recognition. "Mr. Reed," the judge said quietly. The room grew even more silent. Marcus stood calmly near the aisle. "Your Honor," he replied. The simple exchange sent another wave of confusion through the courtroom. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. The judge knew him. Not casually. Not professionally. There was a level of respect in the judge's voice that had not been present before. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench carrying the folder. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the identification once more. Several long seconds passed before he finally spoke. "Court will pause briefly," he announced. No explanation followed. No additional details. Yet the decision itself signaled that something extraordinary had happened. The attorneys immediately stopped discussing the case. Reporters leaned forward in anticipation. Court personnel stood waiting for instructions. Through it all, Marcus remained composed. He showed no frustration. No anger. No desire to challenge anyone. He simply waited. Rebecca watched him carefully. The calmness no longer looked ordinary. It looked intentional. It looked like the confidence of someone who understood exactly who he was and exactly why he was there. The judge looked up again. "Mr. Reed," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I was not expecting today's events to unfold this way." Several people in the gallery exchanged puzzled looks. The statement raised more questions than answers. Marcus nodded politely. "Neither was I, Your Honor." The response only deepened the mystery. Rebecca glanced around the room. She could feel the atmosphere shifting. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like something entirely different. The focus was no longer on the scheduled case. It was on Marcus Reed. Who was he? Why did the judge recognize him? Why did experienced attorneys suddenly appear uneasy? The questions spread through the courtroom like a silent current. Then Judge Whitmore placed the folder carefully on the bench and took a slow breath. The look on his face suggested that a major revelation was approaching. And for the first time that day, Officer Rebecca Collins began to realize that the man she had spent hours quietly judging might possess an authority far greater than anyone in the room had imagined. For several long seconds, nobody inside courtroom 4B seemed willing to breathe. The silence carried a strange weight, as though the entire room understood that whatever happened next would change the meaning of everything that had happened before. Judge Harold Whitmore looked down at the identification documents one final time before setting them carefully on the bench. Then he raised his eyes toward the gallery. "For the record," he said calmly, "I believe it is important that the court understands who Mr. Marcus Reed is." Reporters immediately straightened in their seats. Attorneys stopped whispering. Court clerks exchanged uncertain glances. Even the spectators who had arrived expecting an ordinary hearing now leaned forward with complete attention. Marcus remained standing near the aisle, his expression composed and respectful. He neither encouraged nor resisted the attention. He simply waited. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. Mr. Reed serves as a senior federal oversight investigator assigned to a multi-agency accountability review involving public institutions throughout this region. The words seemed to move through the courtroom like a wave. Several attorneys visibly reacted. One reporter quickly turned a page in her notebook and began writing as fast as possible. Rebecca Collins felt her heartbeat quicken. She stared at Marcus, trying to reconcile the quiet man she had watched all morning with the title she had just heard. The judge continued. Over the past 11 months, Mr. Reed has supervised reviews involving procedural compliance, public accountability standards, and professional conduct assessments across multiple jurisdictions. The room became even quieter. Suddenly Marcus's behavior throughout the morning made sense. The notebook. The observations. The patience. The attention to detail. He had not been attending the hearing as a curious observer. He had been evaluating the environment around him. Rebecca remembered every assumption she had made. Every conclusion she had reached without evidence. Every moment she had convinced herself that instinct alone was enough. None of it felt convincing anymore. Judge Whitmore looked toward Marcus with visible respect. Mr. Reed's work has contributed to several major oversight findings over the past decade, he said. His reputation for professionalism is known throughout both state and federal circles. The revelation stunned many people in the room. Yet what surprised them most was Marcus himself. He showed no pride. No arrogance. No desire to embarrass anyone. He stood exactly as he had stood when nobody knew who he was. Calm. Measured. Professional. One of the reporters finally spoke. Mr. Reed, were you observing this hearing as part of your review? Marcus considered the question carefully. I was observing procedures, interactions, and professional conduct, he answered. His voice remained steady. The same way I do every day. The simplicity of the response somehow made it even more powerful. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. Then I believe everyone present understands the significance of today's events. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. For the first time since the morning began, she was no longer thinking about authority. She was thinking about responsibility. And as the reality of Marcus Reed's identity settled across the courtroom, a new realization emerged. The most powerful person in the room had never demanded attention. He had earned it through patience, discipline, and a commitment to fairness. The hidden truth was finally visible, and nothing about the day would ever be viewed the same way again. The atmosphere inside Courtroom 4B changed completely after the revelation. What had started as a routine legal proceeding now felt like a lesson unfolding in real time. Reporters continued writing furiously. Attorneys sat quietly, absorbing the significance of everything they had just learned. Even the spectators seemed different now. The questions that had filled the room earlier had largely disappeared. In their place stood a clearer understanding of what had happened and why it mattered. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted the documents on the bench and looked toward the court recorder. The record will reflect today's events in full, he said calmly. The statement sounded procedural, but everyone understood its importance. Nothing would be overlooked. Nothing would be ignored. Accountability depended on accuracy, and accuracy required transparency. Marcus Reed remained standing near the aisle. He had become the center of attention without ever seeking it. Throughout the entire morning, he had behaved exactly the same way. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else knew about him. Officer Rebecca Collins stood several feet away, struggling to reconcile the assumptions she had made with the reality now sitting before her. For years she had trusted her instincts above nearly everything else. That confidence had guided countless decisions. Yet standing in that courtroom, she was beginning to understand the danger of reaching conclusions before gathering facts. The realization was uncomfortable. It was also necessary. Near the rear of the courtroom, a county administrative supervisor quietly entered and spoke with courthouse personnel. Several documents were exchanged. Procedures that rarely attracted public attention were now being set into motion. There was no drama in the process. No raised voices. No public confrontation. Just the steady operation of a system designed to review decisions when questions arose. Judge Whitmore acknowledged the supervisor with a brief nod. Appropriate administrative review procedures will follow, he stated for the record. The words echoed softly through the room. Rebecca understood exactly what they meant. The events of the morning would be examined carefully. Reports would be reviewed. Witness statements would be collected. Every step would be documented. For the first time all day, she realized that accountability was not something applied only to other people. It applied equally to everyone entrusted with responsibility. Across the courtroom, Marcus watched quietly. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No sense of victory. He understood something many people never fully learned. Real accountability was not about punishment. It was about trust. Communities trusted institutions because those institutions were willing to examine themselves honestly when mistakes occurred. One of the reporters finally looked toward Marcus. "Do you intend to file any statement regarding today?" she asked. Marcus paused before answering. "The facts will speak for themselves," he replied. The simplicity of the response seemed to settle over the room. Nothing more needed to be said. As the proceedings resumed, the focus gradually returned to the original hearing. Yet everyone present knew they had witnessed something larger than a courtroom dispute. They had witnessed the moment when assumptions collided with facts. They had witnessed the difference between authority and responsibility. And as Officer Rebecca Collins stood quietly beneath the fluorescent lights, she began to understand that the most important lesson of the day was not about power. It was about the obligation to use power carefully, fairly, and with the humility to recognize when certainty has moved ahead of the truth. By late afternoon, the courthouse had begun returning to its normal rhythm. Attorneys packed away files. Reporters gathered final notes before heading back to their newsrooms. Court employees resumed their routines beneath the steady glow of fluorescent lights. The tension that had dominated the day was fading, but the lessons remained. Inside Courtroom 4B, the hearing had concluded. The benches that had been filled only hours earlier now sat mostly empty. The polished wood reflected long beams of sunlight streaming through tall windows as the day slowly moved toward evening. Marcus Reed remained near the front of the courtroom, organizing documents inside his portfolio. He worked quietly, methodically, with the same calm professionalism he had displayed from the moment he arrived that morning. Nothing about his demeanor suggested triumph. Nothing suggested resentment. To him, the events of the day were never about proving a point. They were about ensuring that systems functioned the way they were intended to function. Across the room, Officer Rebecca Collins stood in thoughtful silence. The confidence that had guided her throughout the morning had been replaced by reflection. For the first time in years, she had been forced to confront the difference between certainty and evidence. It was not an easy lesson. Yet as uncomfortable as the experience had been, part of her understood its value. Responsibility demanded more than authority. It demanded discipline, patience, and the willingness to question assumptions before acting upon them. Judge Harold Whitmore finished reviewing several final documents before closing the last folder on his bench. He looked across the nearly empty courtroom and allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. During his years on the bench, he had learned that the most important legal lessons rarely came from dramatic verdicts. They came from moments when ordinary people were reminded why fairness mattered. Today's lesson had arrived unexpectedly, but its message could not have been clearer. As Marcus prepared to leave, one of the younger court clerks approached him. "Mr. Reed," she said politely, "after everything that happened today, how do you stay so calm?" Marcus paused before answering. He glanced toward the empty benches, the witness stand, and the judge's bench before offering a small smile. "Because accountability is not personal," he replied. "It only works when it applies equally to everyone." The clerk nodded thoughtfully. The answer stayed with her long after the conversation ended. A few minutes later, Marcus stepped into the hallway. His footsteps echoed softly against the courthouse floor. Outside, the clouds that had covered the city that morning had finally broken apart. Warm sunlight stretched across the courthouse steps as people moved through the downtown streets below. Life continued. Cases would be heard tomorrow. New arguments would be made. New decisions would be reached. Yet everyone who had witnessed the events of that day would carry something with them. They would remember how quickly assumptions can become mistakes. They would remember that authority without accountability eventually loses its meaning. And they would remember the quiet man who never demanded respect, yet earned it from everyone in the room. As Marcus walked away from the courthouse, one final truth seemed to linger in the air behind him. Some people believe power comes from a title. Others believe it comes from a badge. But real authority begins the moment a person accepts responsibility for their actions, and real justice survives only when the truth matters more than certainty.